Mhm. My name is Wren. And the day I turned 30, my stepfather's family tried to take the only thing my mother ever left me. There were 45 people in that room. 45, and not one of them said a word when my step-uncle stood up, pointed at me, and said I had no business holding on to property that belonged to the bloodline. My mom had been dead 14 months. The flowers on her grave were still fresh enough that I could picture them. And here was this man, this person I'd sat across from at Christmas tables for 12 years, explaining to a room full of people why her house should go to someone else. My half-sister clapped, slow, deliberate, like she was at a performance and he'd just delivered the best line. She looked right at me when she did it. That was the moment I understood something I'd been too soft to admit for years. This wasn't new. This was just the first time they'd said it out loud. So I made one phone call. One quiet 10-minute phone call, and everything they thought they'd built around me started to come apart. But let me back up, because the worst part isn't what they did in that room. The worst part is how long I'd been letting it happen. My mother passed on a Thursday in February, 17 months before any of this. Pancreatic cancer. Fast, the way that kind always is. She was 58 and she went from a cough she thought was a winter cold to a hospice bed in 4 months. I took family leave and drove down to Savannah the week she was diagnosed, and I didn't go back to my apartment in Atlanta until after the funeral. She left me her house. It wasn't a mansion. It was a 1960s brick bungalow on the west side of Savannah with a lemon tree in the backyard and a porch that tilted slightly to the left because the foundation had settled. She'd owned it outright since 2009, paid it off with money from her own mother's estate. There was no mortgage. There was a will, signed and notarized, that said the house went to me, Wren Calloway, her daughter. My stepfather, Roland, had been in her life since I was 11. He was decent enough, I thought. Quiet, kept to himself, showed up to my high school graduation. He and my mother never legally married. They'd talked about it, but she said she liked the way things were. When she died, he was devastated, genuinely. I believed that. What I didn't fully understand was what had been happening in the family around him. Roland had a younger brother named, well, I'll just call him my step-uncle, and a daughter from his first marriage, Petra, who was 22 to my 30 and had grown up mostly with her mother in Charleston. Petra and I had a polite, distant relationship. Holiday texts? A like on Instagram sometimes. I didn't think much about either of them during the grief period. I had enough to carry. The house sat mostly empty for a year while I figured out what to do with it. I drove down every month or so to check on things, water the lemon tree, make sure nothing was leaking. I was paying the property taxes and the utilities. I had considered renting it out, but something in me kept resisting. It still smelled like her perfume in the bedroom closet. I wasn't ready. The invitation came in April. It was addressed to the whole family, Roland's whole network of people, framed as a remembrance gathering for the 1-year anniversary of my mother's passing. I thought it was a tender idea. I thought maybe Roland was trying to do something meaningful, bring people together to honor her. I should have looked more carefully at who had organized it. The gathering was held at Roland's house, which was the house he and my mother had shared before she passed. He still lived there. It was smaller than my mother's bungalow, a rental actually, and he dressed up the living room with framed photos and candles and a table of food that smelled like someone had genuinely tried. I arrived with a dish I'd made from one of my mother's recipes, her green rice casserole, the one she made every Easter. I had to call my aunt 3 times to get the proportions right. I carried it in, wrapped in a dish towel printed with lemons. There were more people than I expected. Roland's coworkers, a few neighbors, some cousins I'd met twice, and Petra, standing near the drinks table in a black wrap dress, talking to a man I didn't recognize. She waved when she saw me. Casual. Easy. Nobody told me there was a seating arrangement until I tried to sit near the front, and a woman I'd never met said that section was reserved. She didn't say for whom. I found a folding chair near the kitchen doorway, between a stack of extra napkins and a speaker playing low acoustic music. The photos on the remembrance table were all from Roland's side. His holidays, his trips, his family milestones. One photo featured my mother, at Roland's sister's wedding, standing in the back, slightly out of frame. That was it. One photo. At a remembrance gathering for her, I set my casserole down and stood there looking at that table for longer than I should have. Roland spoke first. He was emotional, sincere, talked about missing her every day. I believed him. Then his sister spoke. Then a coworker. Each of them referred to my mother mostly in relation to Roland, his partner, his companion, the woman who made his house a home. No one mentioned she had a daughter. Not until my step-uncle stood up. He was a big man, Roland's younger brother. Flooring contractor, spent a lot of time outdoors, the kind of person who filled a room just by walking into it. He'd always been loud at family events in a way that felt performative. He liked being heard. "I want to talk about something practical," he said, and the shift in the room was immediate. A few people straightened up. Roland looked at the floor. He said that grief was one thing, but legacy was another. He said that my mother's house, the bungalow, the one she'd owned outright, the one she'd left to me, was sitting empty and doing nobody any good. He said that Petra, Roland's daughter, was young and just starting out, and that it wasn't right for a family property to be tied up with someone who wasn't even really connected to Roland's people. He didn't use my name once. He called me Roland's stepdaughter like that was a diminishment. "The girl doesn't even live in Savannah," he said. "She's up in Atlanta. She's got her own life. That house belongs here, with family." The room was very quiet. Then Petra started clapping. Slow, deliberate, like punctuation. 2 or 3 people joined in, uncomfortable the way people clap when they're not sure if it's appropriate, but they don't want to be the one who doesn't. I was standing near the kitchen doorway. I hadn't moved. I could feel my face doing something controlled, something careful, and beneath it something else entirely. Roland looked at me finally. He looked the way people look when they've known something is coming and have been dreading it, and are also maybe a little relieved it's finally out in the open. "She did leave it to Wren," he said quietly. "To the room, not quite to me." "That's not the point," my step-uncle said. "The point is what's right for the family." And that's when I spoke. "That house is mine," I said. Steady. Not loud. "My mother's name is on the deed and mine is in her will, and there is nothing to discuss." My step-uncle's expression shifted, not to anger, to something more practiced. Like he'd expected resistance and had already prepared for it. "You're being selfish," he said. "She would have wanted it to go to people who needed it." My half-sister, Petra, tilted her head and gave me that look, the one that says I'm just watching, this isn't really about me, while everything in her posture says the opposite. "She left it to me," I said again. Then I picked up the dish towel printed with lemons from where I'd set it on the counter, put it in my bag, and walked out. My hands were shaking by the time I reached my car. Not from fear, from something colder and more deliberate. The kind of feeling that doesn't dissipate, it settles. I sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes. Then I scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in over a year. My mother's estate attorney. A woman named, I'll call her my attorney because that's what she was. Sharp, efficient, one of those people whose calmness makes you feel like the situation is already more manageable than it seemed a moment ago. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "I think there's going to be a problem with the property," I said. "Tell me everything," she said. I did. I drove back to Atlanta that night instead of staying over like I'd planned. The highway was quiet, the kind of Sunday night quiet that makes you aware of your own thoughts whether you want to be or not. I didn't play music, I just drove. The bungalow was mine, I knew that. The paperwork was airtight, but my attorney had said something that stayed with me. Knowing you're right and being protected are 2 different things. She told me to pull together everything, the deed, the will, any financial records connected to the property. She said to do it before the week was out. When I got home, I opened my laptop and started. My mother had been meticulous. She kept everything in a 3-ring binder in the top shelf of her closet, organized by year, with little labeled tabs. I had taken that binder after the funeral because I didn't know what else to take. It had been sitting on my bookshelf for over a year. I opened it for the first time that night. There was the deed. Clear. Her name, then transferred to mine as beneficiary. There was the will. Notarized, witnessed by 2 people. There was also something I hadn't expected. A folder in the back, unlabeled, held a set of documents from 2019. A loan agreement between my mother and Roland. She had lent him $22,000. I could see that clearly from the typed amounts. The repayment schedule was outlined, signed by both of them. Below it, a handwritten note in her handwriting. He has paid back $4,000 as of March 2021. Remaining balance $18,000. She had written that 3 months before her diagnosis. I sat with that for a long time. Then I kept reading. There was a second document from 2020, a letter from my mother to a bank removing Roland as a co-authorized contact on her personal savings account, dated 6 months after the loan. No explanation was written, but the timing said something. And there was a third thing, a short email chain, printed out. My mother's handwriting had circled one email and written next to it, "Why is he asking about the house now?" The email was from Roland to my mother, asking whether she'd thought about what would happen to the bungalow in the event that she wasn't around. He'd included in the same email a note about Petra's situation. She was having trouble with housing at the time. My mother's response, also printed, was 3 sentences. "The house goes to Wren. That is not a conversation. Please don't bring this up again." That email was dated 8 months before she passed. I sat back. My chest felt very full. Not with grief, exactly. More with the particular weight of realizing that someone you loved had been carrying a quiet war and hadn't told you because she didn't want you to worry. She knew. She'd known for a while. And she had documented it. My attorney called the next morning before I'd finished my coffee. "I've been doing some preliminary research," she said. "There's nothing they can do through the courts, not with a clean will and deed. But I'd like you to know about an activity on the property." She said that Roland, or someone using Roland's address, had made an inquiry to the city assessor's office about the bungalow. The inquiry was a records request, the kind you make when you're researching ownership history, normal enough on its own. Except it had been filed 6 weeks ago, 2 months before the remembrance gathering. This was planned. I asked her what I should do. "Send a certified letter to Roland," she said. "Formal notice that the property is yours, that any contact regarding the transfer of ownership will be treated as harassment, and that you are in communication with legal counsel. Then I want you to get down to Savannah and walk through that house to make sure nothing has been moved or removed." I drove back that Friday. The house looked the same from the outside. The lemon tree was leafing out. The porch still tilted slightly left. I unlocked the front door with the key on my keychain, the key my mother had pressed into my hand in the hospice room when she still had the strength to do it. Inside, everything was where I'd left it. Mostly, but in the small room off the kitchen that my mother had used as a study, the filing cabinet was slightly ajar. The bottom drawer, the one with the hanging folders for her financial records, had been gone through. A few folders were out of order. Nothing was missing that I could immediately identify, but something had been disturbed. I hadn't been in the house in 6 weeks. I stood there in the study for a moment, very still, looking at that filing cabinet. Then I took out my phone and photographed everything. Then I checked the back door. The lock was original, from when she'd moved in. The kind a locksmith could open in under a minute. I photographed it. I drove to a hardware store before I left and bought new deadbolts for both doors. When I got back, my hands steadier now, I also checked the cabinet in the bedroom. That one was fine. But in the closet where my mother had kept her 3-ring binder, the shelf was dusty and there was a clean rectangle where something had been sitting, something binder-sized. They had come looking. Whatever they hoped to find or take, they didn't get the binder. I had it. It was in Atlanta on my bookshelf, and now it was going directly into my attorney's safe. That night, after installing the new locks alone in the quiet of my mother's house, I sat on the porch in the dark. The street was still. A neighbor's cat walked across the sidewalk and regarded me without interest. I hadn't cried much since my mother died. I'd been too busy and then too numb, and then too focused on practical things. But sitting on that tilted porch in the dark, I finally let myself be angry. Not dramatic, not loud, just fully, cleanly angry. They had planned this. They had filed the records request while I was still in my Atlanta apartment grieving. They had organized a gathering in my mother's honor and used it to publicly pressure me in front of witnesses. They had come into her house, she had written. Why is he asking about the house now? 8 months before she died. She had sensed it. And she had protected me, quietly, with a filing cabinet and a 3-ring binder and a notarized will. Because she knew. I went inside and called my attorney back. There's been an unauthorized entry, I said. Things moved faster after that. My attorney filed a formal trespass notice with the Savannah PD and sent a cease and desist to Roland directly. She also flagged the records inquiry to the assessor's office as part of a potential harassment pattern around disputed property. Roland called me that evening. His voice was quiet, almost tired. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "No," I said. "It got out of hand when your brother stood up in front of 45 people and called my mother's house a family property. What I'm doing now is just responding." There was a pause. "Petra really is struggling," he said. Like that explained it. "I know," I said. "That's not my responsibility." Another pause. Longer. "Your mother would have." "Don't," I said. "Don't finish that." He didn't. I told him clearly. The house was mine. I intended to keep it, and if anyone connected to his family approached the property again without my explicit written permission, I would pursue it legally. I wasn't angry when I said it. I was just stating facts. He hung up without saying goodbye. The following week, my step-uncle sent a message through Roland's phone, not to me directly, to Roland, who then forwarded it, maybe not thinking about what it meant that he was forwarding it. The message said that they were exploring their options and that I should understand that people who sit on resources they don't use have a way of losing them eventually. I saved it, forwarded it to my attorney. She said it wasn't legally actionable on its own, but to keep collecting. Then Petra posted something. Not about me directly, just a general thing on her public account, about how grief is made worse by family members who choose property over people. The comments were supportive. A few of Roland's family members liked it. I didn't respond. I didn't send the message. I took a screenshot, labeled it with the date, and added it to a folder I'd started on my desktop called Kaylin Documentation, then changed the name. My documentation folder. I kept collecting. What they didn't know, what I hadn't decided to use yet, was the loan document. The $18,000 Roland still owed my mother's estate. When someone dies with outstanding debts owed to them, those debts don't evaporate. They become part of the estate, which I was the sole beneficiary of. My attorney confirmed it with a single clear sentence. Roland owes the estate $18,000. You can pursue that. I sat with that information for a week before I decided what to do with it. The thing I kept coming back to wasn't the money. It was the pattern. Roland had been thinking about this house since before she died. His brother had been ready with a speech. Petra had known to clap at the right moment. This wasn't grief making people act badly. This was a plan that had been in motion for months, maybe longer. And the whole time I'd been driving down once a month to water the lemon tree. What finally moved me to act wasn't something dramatic. It was a voicemail, left on the house line, the landline my mother had kept, that I hadn't disconnected because it felt like too much, from my step-uncle. He didn't identify himself. He said, voice easy and conversational, that he knew a developer who was interested in that corridor, that properties like mine were getting bought up fast, and that if I were smart, I'd get ahead of it by talking to the family before someone made a worse offer. He called my mother's house a property like mine. Not my mother's. Mine, like it was already a business transaction. I saved the voicemail. I had my attorney send it to a media attorney she knew who handled harassment cases involving estates. And then I called the developer my step-uncle had mentioned. He dropped the name and asked whether they'd been in contact with anyone representing the property. They hadn't. There was no offer. There was no developer interest. He'd made it up. I wrote a single text to Roland. No greeting, no explanation. Just tell your brother to stop calling the house line. The next contact goes to the police. Then I sent the voicemail to 3 of my mother's closest friends who still lived in Savannah, women she'd known for decades, who had sat with her in those last months, who had adored her. I didn't ask them to do anything. I just told them what had been happening. They were furious. Within 48 hours, the social fabric in that neighborhood, which is the kind of neighborhood where people have known each other for 30 years, had shifted. Roland's sister called him. His coworkers heard things. Petra's post got context. It hadn't had before, because my mother's friends were not subtle, and they had decades of social capital and exactly 0 patience for what had been done. I didn't say a word publicly. I didn't need to. Truth, when you give it to the right people, moves on its own. My attorney sent Roland a formal estate demand letter for the $18,000 loan outstanding, certified mail, return receipt. He had 30 days to respond. He responded in 9 through his own attorney with an offer to settle. He proposed paying back $11,000 and releasing any claim to the property in writing. My attorney sent back a counteroffer full $18,000, signed legal relinquishment of any claim to the bungalow by Roland, his brother, and his daughter, and a formal acknowledgement that the property transfer attempts had been improper. He accepted. I was sitting in my Atlanta apartment when she called to tell me. It was a Tuesday early evening. The light coming through the window at that low angle that makes everything look briefly golden. I had a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "It's done," she said. "He signed everything." I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there for a while in the quiet. Then I drove back to Savannah that weekend. I didn't go to Roland's side of town. I went straight to the bungalow, unlocked it with my key, walked through every room the way you do when you're checking whether a place is still yours. The study, the bedroom, the kitchen, with the window above the sink that always fogged up in winter. Out back, the lemon tree had produced fruit since I'd last been there. Clusters of small yellow lemons hanging low on the branches. I stood under it for a while. My mother had planted that tree the year she paid off the house. She'd told me that once, casually, like it wasn't one of the most intentional things a person could do. She'd planted something that took years to fruit in the yard she'd fought to own as a quiet record of what she'd built. I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't need to. I went inside, opened the windows to let the air move through, and started making a list of what it would take to make the place livable again. Not a rental. Not a legacy. Just a home. Mine. The porch still tilted to the left. The foundation had settled years ago, and it would cost more to fix than it was worth. My mother had lived with it for 16 years. I sat down in her old chair, the wicker one she'd had since before I was born, and I looked out at the street. A neighbor walked by with a dog. She looked up, saw me, and raised her hand. I raised mine back. Nobody had to explain anything. That house had always had someone in it who belonged there. And now it did again. What would you do if the people who were supposed to grieve with you turned grief into a transaction? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and subscribe. There are more stories coming, real, hard, and worth telling. I've thought a lot about what made that room possible. 45 people, and not one of them said wait. Not one of them looked at me and thought, she just lost her mother 14 months ago. Maybe this isn't the moment. And for a long time I kept asking myself why. What was it about that gathering, that speech, that slow clap, that made otherwise decent people just sit there? I think the honest answer is that people follow whoever appears most certain. My step-uncle stood up like he already knew the outcome. Petra clapped like it was already decided. And the room, full of people who probably had no strong feelings either way, took their cue from the performance. That's not cruelty exactly. It's something more ordinary and in some ways harder to forgive. It's passivity dressed up as agreement. What I know now, that I didn't know at 30, is that documentation is a form of love. My mother didn't leave me just a house. She left me proof. She left me a binder with tabs and dates and a handwritten note that said, remaining balance $18,000 in her careful, slightly slanted cursive. She left me a printed email with her own words circled in pen. Why is he asking about the house now? She had seen it coming. She had no way to protect me from the grief of losing her. But she did everything she could to protect me from what came after. That's the kind of intelligence that doesn't get talked about enough, the quiet, unglamorous kind that shows up as a 3-ring binder on a closet shelf. I think about Roland sometimes. Not with hatred, because I genuinely believe he loved my mother in his way. But love doesn't excuse a records inquiry filed 6 weeks before a remembrance gathering. Good intentions don't cancel a pattern. What I've come to understand is that people reveal who they are not in their grief, but in what they want from it. Roland's grief was real. What he did with it, or allowed to be done in his orbit, was a choice, The $18,000 was never really about the money, it was about the record. When my attorney sent that demand letter, it said something that no speech in a decorated living room could unsay. There is documentation, and it does not agree with your version of events. That's the thing about truth held quietly and carefully over time. It doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to exist. The lemon tree is doing well. I checked on it last month. My mother planted it the year she paid off the house, which is one of the most deliberately hopeful things I've ever heard of anyone doing. You don't plant a lemon tree for yourself. They take years to produce anything. You plant one because you intend to stay and because you're thinking about who comes after you. I'm staying. The porch still tilts to the left, and I've decided I'm not fixing it. Some things you inherit, not in spite of their imperfections, but because of them. My mother lived with that tilt for 16 years. It felt wrong to straighten it now, like editing someone else's sentence. What happened to me wasn't unique. Plenty of people lose a parent and then spend years fending off the people who mistake grief for opportunity. If you're in that, I want you to hear this. Document everything. Find counsel early and do not apologize for holding on to what is yours. Kindness is not the same as compliance. You can be a decent person and still refuse to hand over your mother's house. Those two things are not in conflict. The neighbor who raised her hand at me that evening. I learned later she'd known my mother for 11 years. She said she used to see her out front in the early mornings, drinking coffee on that tilted porch before the day started. I do that now too.